In a bustling corner of downtown Miami, a notorious motorcycle gang thought they had found their next victim, an overweight taxi driver quietly minding his business at Rosa's Cuban cafe. They taunted him, shoved his table, and threatened him with violence, completely unaware they had just challenged one of the most skilled Secret Service agents in the Southeast, a decorated former presidential protection specialist with 15 years of elite tactical experience working deep undercover to investigate a criminal network. But this isn't just another story about law enforcement triumph. It's about redemption, transformation, and how one heated moment reshaped an entire neighborhood's destiny. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ocean Drive as Thomas Big Tom Rodriguez settled into his usual corner booth at Rosa's, his worn leather taxi wallet placed carefully beside a steaming cup of Cuban coffee. His weathered hands, calloused from years of specialized training disguised beneath a facade of mundane work, wrapped around the small cup as he observed the morning regulars through heavy-lidded eyes that missed nothing. Rosa Menendez, the cafe's owner, moved between tables with practiced ease, her bright smile masking the worry that had become constant since the Iron Wolves motorcycle gang had started marking their territory in the neighborhood. The cafe's morning crowd moved with cautious efficiency, local shop owners grabbing breakfast before opening, hotel workers ending their night shifts, and tourists still adjusting to the vibrant energy of Miami Beach. Tom's tactical mind, honed through years of protecting the nation's most important leaders, cataloged each face, each movement, maintaining his cover as just another working-class driver starting his day. The peaceful morning routine shattered as the thunderous roar of custom motorcycles echoed off the Art Deco facades. 7 bikes, chrome gleaming in the Florida sun, pulled up to the curb in a coordinated formation that spoke of military background. Their leader, Marcus Skull Blackwood, dismounted first, his massive frame casting a shadow across the cafe's front window. The Iron Wolves had been expanding their territory across South Beach, but they had never been bold enough to enter Rosa's before. The bell above the door chimed as Skull ducked his head to enter, followed by his core crew. Jack Razor Martinez, Chris Storm Wilson, Mike Fury Anderson, and 3 prospects whose nervous energy betrayed their recent recruitment. Skull's eyes swept the cafe methodically, a habit Tom immediately recognized from his own counter-surveillance training, until they landed on the large taxi driver occupying the corner booth. A predatory smile spread across his face as he nudged Razor, pointing out their seemingly vulnerable target. The other patrons suddenly became intensely interested in their plates, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Tom didn't look up from his coffee, but his posture shifted imperceptibly. 15 years of protecting presidents and foreign dignitaries had taught him to recognize imminent threats, and these men were broadcasting their intentions with every movement. He maintained his carefully crafted appearance of disinterest, counting footsteps as the bikers spread through the cafe. Well, Skull's voice carried across the quiet space. What do we have here? Miami's finest taxi service taking up valuable real estate. Rosa stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. This is my cafe, and everyone is welcome here as long as they respect my rules. Skull's laugh was like gravel in a blender. Your cafe? That's adorable, Mama. But everything in South Beach belongs to the Iron Wolves now. Tom's fingers tightened slightly around his cup, the familiar weight of his concealed sidearm pressing against his ribs under his oversized shirt. The weapon was an old friend, carefully hidden beneath the perfect cover story of a man who had let himself go after years of late-night fast food and sedentary work. Storm, the youngest of the group, swaggered over to Tom's booth. Hey, fat boy, nice driving job. Must be real challenging pushing that pedal all day. The cafe had gone completely silent. Even the sizzle of Cuban sandwiches on the grill seemed muted, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Tom slowly raised his eyes from his coffee, meeting Storm's gaze with a steadiness that made the young biker unconsciously step back. There was something in that look, something that didn't fit with the casual dismissal of an overweight taxi driver. It was the kind of look that had stared down threats to national security, the kind of focus that came from years of elite training. The only challenge, Tom replied evenly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent cafe, is dealing with people who don't understand the meaning of respect. His words were carefully chosen, maintaining his cover while sending a clear message. His accent was perfect Miami local, masking years of specialized linguistic training. Skull's face darkened as he strode toward the booth, his boots heavy on the tile floor. "You got something to say, fat man?" "Because around here, respect is earned through blood." Tom set his coffee cup down with deliberate precision, his movements economical and controlled, the kind of efficiency that came from thousands of hours of close protection drills, though none of the bikers recognized it for what it was. "The only thing I'm saying," Tom responded, making a show of checking his taximeter app, "is that my coffee break is over. Rosa, what do I owe you?" Before Rosa could answer, Skull's hand shot out, knocking the coffee cup off the table. It shattered on the floor, dark liquid spreading across the worn tiles like an oil slick. The scene was set, the players in position, and as Tom looked at his spilled coffee, then up at Skull, his eyes changed. The carefully maintained facade of a simple taxi driver flickered for just a moment, revealing something that made several of the bikers shift uncomfortably. They had come looking for an easy target, but they had found something else entirely. A highly trained operative who had spent his career preparing for moments exactly like this. The other bikers moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around the booth, their leather vests creaking with each movement. They were used to this dance: intimidate, threaten, dominate. But something about Tom's stillness was making them uneasy. It wasn't the typical fear they expected from their victims. It was something else, something they couldn't quite identify. Rosa watched the scene unfold from behind her counter, her hand already inching toward the phone where she had Detective Carlos Ramirez's direct number programmed. He'd given it to her 3 months ago, when the Iron Wolves first started appearing in South Beach, warning her about their growing influence. Through the cafe's windows, the morning sun illuminated the Art Deco buildings across Ocean Drive, their pastel colors a stark contrast to the darkness unfolding inside. Tom remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert, years of protective service training hidden beneath a carefully maintained image of complacency. The next few moments would determine whether this situation ended in violence or submission, and Tom had spent too many years protecting others to submit to common thugs who didn't understand who they were really dealing with. Skull's massive hand reached for Tom's collar, his fingers curling into the worn fabric of the oversized polo shirt with Ocean Drive Taxi embroidered on the pocket. The biker's face twisted into a sneer, expecting the usual fear, the typical submission he got from his victims. But as his grip tightened, something changed in the air of the small cafe. Through the windows, tourists had begun to gather, phones raised, drawn by the sight of the infamous Iron Wolves apparently harassing a helpless taxi driver. What their cameras captured next would become something entirely different from what they expected. "You know what I think?" Skull continued, leaning down to get in Tom's face, tobacco-stained breath mixing with expensive cologne. "I think you're just another fat, lazy driver who couldn't hack it in the real world. Probably got some sad story about bad knees or a bad back. Well, guess what? This is our territory now, and we don't like your kind taking up space." The morning sun had fully broken through the clouds, streaming through Rosa's windows to illuminate the scene. Tom remained seated, his breathing steady and controlled. His mind flashed back to his last active protection detail, 3 years ago in Berlin, when he'd spotted a potential threat in a crowd of thousands. The same calm had settled over him then, the same clarity of purpose. The regulars at Rosa's had come to know Big Tom over the past 8 months since he'd started his deep cover assignment. They saw him as a friendly local fixture, always ready with a joke or a kind word, his generous tips and gentle demeanor masking a purpose none of them could have guessed. Even Rosa, who had grown to consider him a friend, didn't know that his apparent weight gain was partially tactical padding, or that his seemingly casual observation of the cafe was actually highly trained surveillance. Skull's grip on Tom's collar tightened as Razor moved to flank the booth. "Maybe we need to take this outside," Razor suggested, his voice carrying an edge of anticipation. "Show Taxi Man here how we deal with disrespect in South Beach." The other bikers shifted, some eager for violence, others showing hints of uncertainty. They had done this dance before, but something felt different this time. Tom's mind raced through scenarios, evaluating threats and exits with the same precision he'd once used to plan presidential evacuation routes. The young prospects by the door, nervous, undertrained, likely to run rather than fight. Razor and Storm, military experience based on their stance and movement patterns. Skull, the real threat, trained but undisciplined, anger issues that could be exploited. Rosa's hand hovered over her phone, but she hesitated. In all the months she'd known Tom, she'd never seen him angry, never seen him raise his voice. Even now, facing down 7 bikers, his expression remained calm, almost detached, as if he were observing a situation from a distance rather than being in the middle of it. Through the windows, more people had gathered, their phones recording what they thought would be another example of gang intimidation in a neighborhood that had seen too much of it lately. Instead, they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of appearances and assumptions. "Last chance," Skull growled, his fingers twisting deeper into Tom's collar. "Show some respect, or things get ugly." The tension in the cafe had reached a breaking point. Every eye was fixed on the scene, every breath held in anticipation of violence. Tom's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire space. "Respect," he said, his eyes meeting Skull's with unwavering focus, "is earned through actions, not threats. And right now, your actions are about to earn you something you didn't expect." The shift in Tom's tone was subtle but profound. For just a moment, the carefully crafted facade of the easygoing taxi driver slipped, revealing something that made several of the bikers take unconscious steps backward. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he said them, with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from years of handling real threats to national security. Skull's first swing was a telegraphed haymaker, the kind of punch that relied more on intimidation than technique. Tom moved with a speed that seemed impossible for his size, his hand shooting up to catch Skull's wrist in a grip that made the bigger man's eyes widen in surprise. The movement was precise, controlled, and spoke of years of training that no one in the cafe had suspected. "Take your hand off me." Tom's voice remained quiet, but carried an edge of steel that made several of the bikers shift uncomfortably. "While you still have the choice." Skull tried to pull his arm back, but Tom's grip was like iron, his fingers finding pressure points that sent waves of pain up the biker's arm. For a moment, confusion flickered across Skull's face, quickly replaced by rage. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone who looked as vulnerable as Tom. "Storm, Razor," Skull barked, his voice tight with pain and anger. "Show this fat boy what happens when people don't show proper respect." The 2 bikers moved forward, but their usual confidence was shaken by Tom's display of strength. They had expected an easy target, a simple show of force to reinforce their territory. What they found instead was something entirely different. Rosa's voice cut through the tension. "Stop this right now, or I'm calling the police." Tom released Skull's wrist, his movements deliberate and controlled. The memory of another confrontation years ago in Dubai flashed through his mind. He had been Agent Thomas Rodriguez then, coordinating security for a high-stakes diplomatic meeting. The same calm had settled over him then, the same clarity of purpose. Storm lunged forward suddenly, but Tom didn't even seem to move. Somehow the young biker found himself sprawled across an empty table, plates and silverware clattering to the floor. The takedown had been so smooth, so efficient, that most observers would have missed exactly how it happened. But Detective Carlos Ramirez, who had just entered the cafe, recognized the technique immediately. It was the kind of move taught to elite protective services, not something a taxi driver should know. "Everything okay in here, Rosa?" Ramirez asked, his hand resting casually on his holster. His eyes took in the scene, the spilled coffee, Storm sprawled across the table, the tension in the air. Then his gaze settled on Tom, and something like recognition flickered across his face. 20 years on the force had taught him to spot fellow law enforcement, even when they were undercover. Skull's hand moved toward his back, but before he could complete the movement, Tom's voice stopped him. "Think carefully about your next move," he said, still seated but radiating a presence that filled the entire cafe. Things can go very badly, very quickly. The words carried weight, not just from their meaning but from the absolute certainty behind them. The other patrons watched in stunned silence as the dynamic in the room shifted. The Iron Wolves, who had entered with such swagger and confidence, now seemed uncertain, their formation broken, their usual intimidation tactics ineffective against an opponent they couldn't understand. "Funny kind of taxi driver," Ramirez observed, moving further into the cafe. "The kind that knows Special Forces takedown techniques." His comment made several of the bikers look at Tom with new eyes, finally beginning to realize that there was much more to this situation than they had initially assumed. Skull's face had turned dark with rage. Nobody challenged the Iron Wolves, especially not in their own claimed territory. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Tom stood slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. For the first time, the bikers seemed to notice something different about him. Despite his apparent bulk, there was a core of steel in his bearing that couldn't be hidden. It was in the way he held himself, the economy of his movements, the steady evaluation in his eyes. "The only mistake," Tom replied, his voice carrying across the silent cafe, "was thinking you could walk in here and threaten innocent people without consequences." The shift in his demeanor was subtle but profound, like watching storm clouds gather on a clear day. This neighborhood isn't your playground, and these people aren't your victims. Through the cafe's windows, more spectators had gathered, phones recording every moment. The Iron Wolves' reputation for intimidation was being challenged in broad daylight, and the video was already spreading across social media. What had started as a simple show of force was becoming something else entirely, a moment that would spark a change in the neighborhood's power dynamic. Detective Ramirez positioned himself strategically, his experienced eye noting how Tom had maneuvered the bikers away from the other patrons, protecting civilians even while maintaining his cover. It was the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of specialized training, not from driving a taxi. The tension in the cafe balanced on a knife's edge. The Iron Wolves' reputation was at stake, but they had never faced an opponent like this. Someone who seemed to know exactly how to handle their type of threat. Someone whose apparent vulnerability masked a deadly competence. The video of the confrontation at Rosa's spread through South Beach like wildfire. Within hours, different angles of the incident flooded social media, showing the moment when an apparently overweight taxi driver had systematically dismantled the Iron Wolves' intimidation tactics. The comment sections exploded with speculation about Big Tom's true identity, while local news channels ran the footage on repeat, highlighting the neighborhood's ongoing struggles with gang presence. Detective Ramirez sat across from Tom in a quiet corner of the Miami Beach Police Department, 2 cups of coffee between them, both untouched. The detective's office was small but strategic, facing the street while offering cover from outside observation. "So," Ramirez began, sliding a file across the desk, "want to tell me how a Secret Service agent ends up playing taxi driver in my jurisdiction?" Tom's response was measured, calculating how much to reveal. "You know I can't discuss operational details, Detective." His voice had changed subtly, the local accent giving way to a more neutral tone. "But let's just say there's more happening in South Beach than motorcycle gangs throwing their weight around." Through the office window, they could see Ocean Drive, where the Iron Wolves' motorcycles had become a less frequent sight since the incident at Rosa's. The gang's usual swagger had been replaced by a tense watchfulness, their reputation damaged by the viral videos of their confrontation with a simple taxi driver. "We've been tracking money movements," Ramirez shared, understanding the need for professional courtesy between agencies. "The Iron Wolves aren't just about territory anymore. Someone's using them for something bigger." Tom nodded slightly, neither confirming nor denying, but his interest was clear. Back at Rosa's, the morning crowd had grown larger in the days following the incident. Locals who had stayed away out of fear of the Iron Wolves now returned, drawn by both the excellent Cuban coffee and the presence of Big Tom, who had become something of a neighborhood legend. Rosa moved between tables with renewed confidence, though her eyes still occasionally darted to the door whenever motorcycles passed by. The cafe had become a symbol of resistance, but more than that, it had become a gathering point for people who were tired of living in fear. Shop owners lingered over their morning coffee, discussing ways to protect their businesses. Hotel workers shared stories of encounters with the gang, no longer afraid to speak up. Even the tourists seemed to sense the change, many specifically requesting photos with the hero taxi driver. Tom maintained his cover meticulously, playing the role of the humble cabbie, thrust into an unexpected spotlight. But beneath his carefully crafted exterior, he observed everything. The way certain customers passed packages under tables, the pattern of phone calls made from the back booth, the occasional flash of expensive watches on individuals who seemed out of place in the modest cafe. "Your cover's still intact," Ramirez assured him during another meeting, this time in the back of Tom's taxi parked near South Point. "Most people think you're just a lucky guy who knew some self-defense. But Skull and his inner circle, they're not buying it. They're asking questions, making calls." The investigation was reaching a critical phase. What had started as a routine operation to track international money laundering had evolved into something more complex. The Iron Wolves weren't just street thugs. They were part of a sophisticated network using Miami's vibrant tourist economy to clean dirty money from across the Americas. Rosa noticed the changes in her neighborhood first. The Iron Wolves' absence had created a vacuum, but instead of another gang moving in, something unexpected happened. Local business owners began organizing, sharing security cameras and alert systems. Young people who might have been recruited by the gang were instead finding support from a community that was finally standing together. "They're planning something," Tom reported to his handler during a secured video call from a safe house in North Beach. "The Iron Wolves lost face that day at the cafe. They can't let it stand, not if they want to maintain their position in the larger organization." The handler's response was measured, concerned about the operation's exposure but recognizing the potential opportunity. The community's transformation continued to surprise everyone involved. What had started as a simple confrontation had sparked a movement. Local business owners who had paid protection money for years now spoke openly about establishing a legitimate security cooperative. Former gang members, inspired by the stand at Rosa's, began reaching out to community leaders, looking for ways to change their paths. Detective Ramirez found himself at the center of it all, carefully balancing his knowledge of Tom's true identity with his duty to the community. He helped coordinate increased police patrols not to intimidate but to support the neighborhood's growing sense of empowerment. "You've started something here," he told Tom during another clandestine meeting, "whether you meant to or not." Tom watched the changes unfold with mixed emotions. His mission was crucial, tracking international financial crimes that threatened national security, but he couldn't deny the impact his actions had had on the local level. The community's transformation was an unexpected variable in an already complex operation, one that could either compromise everything or provide the perfect cover for what was to come. As the sun set over Ocean Drive, casting long shadows across the Art Deco facades, Tom sat in his taxi, observing the street life while monitoring coded transmissions from his agency. The Iron Wolves were regrouping, planning their response, unaware that their every move was being watched not just by one undercover agent, but by an entire community that had finally found its courage. The first brick crashed through Rosa's front window at 3 a.m., shattering the pre-dawn silence. Security cameras captured 3 motorcycles racing away, their riders wearing the Iron Wolves colors. By sunrise, similar attacks had targeted 4 other businesses that had stopped paying protection money. The message was clear. The gang wasn't going to let their control slip away without a fight. Tom received the alert while parked outside the Fontainebleau, ostensibly waiting for early morning airport runs, but actually monitoring a suspected money drop. The attack on Rosa's wasn't unexpected, but it still made his jaw tighten. He'd grown genuinely fond of the cafe and its owner during his months undercover, a dangerous sentiment in his line of work. "They hit Pete's Market too," Detective Ramirez reported when Tom arrived at Rosa's. The detective was helping sweep up broken glass while crime scene technicians documented the damage. "And Maria's boutique, the beachside pharmacy, and that new art gallery on Collins." The pattern was strategic, targeting businesses that had been vocal about standing up to the gang. Rosa stood among the shattered glass, her face set in determined lines. "They think this will make us afraid again," she said, already brewing coffee for the growing crowd of supporters who had shown up to help clean. "But they don't understand. We're not going back to living in fear." Through his earpiece, Tom heard chatter from other agents monitoring Iron Wolves' movements. The gang's leadership had gathered at their clubhouse, a converted warehouse near the port. Electronic surveillance picked up fragments of heated arguments. The attack had split the organization, with younger members questioning the wisdom of escalating the conflict. "Your cover identity is still holding," his handler assured him during an encrypted video call. "But the Treasury Department is getting nervous. If the Iron Wolves money laundering operation gets disrupted too soon, we could lose the connection to their international partners." The community's response to the attacks surprised everyone. Instead of retreating in fear, people rallied. Local contractors offered to repair the damaged businesses for free. Security companies provided upgraded systems at cost. Even tourists joined in, with several high-end hotels organizing fundraisers for the affected businesses. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Iron Wolves hadn't built their criminal empire by accepting defeat. Intelligence suggested they were calling in reinforcements from other chapters, preparing for something bigger. Tom's taxi routes now took him past increased gang activity, new faces appearing in their territory, weapons being moved, money changing hands. "They're planning a show of force," Tom reported during an emergency meeting with Ramirez and his handler in a secured hotel room. "But that's not what worries me. These attacks, they're too obvious, too public. The real threat is what we're not seeing." Surveillance photos spread across the hotel room's desk showed key Iron Wolves members meeting with well-dressed individuals near the port. "These aren't street thugs," Tom pointed out. "Look at their watches, their shoes. These are cartel representatives, maybe worse." The investigation had reached a critical phase. The Iron Wolves' desperation to maintain control of their territory was pushing them to take risks, making mistakes that could expose their entire operation. But it also made them more dangerous than ever. Rosa's cafe became a symbol of resistance, staying open later, hosting community meetings disguised as casual gatherings. Tom maintained his cover as the humble taxi driver turned local hero, but his trained eyes never stopped watching. He noticed the patterns, certain customers who always paid in cash, phone calls made at specific times, packages exchanged in seemingly casual interactions. "The money's moving differently now," he told his handler. "They're adapting, using new routes, new methods. The attacks on the businesses are a distraction. Something bigger is coming." The Iron Wolves' retaliation continued in subtle ways. Small fires started mysteriously behind businesses that supported the community's resistance. Cars belonging to vocal opponents of the gang were vandalized. Anonymous threats were made to family members of those who stood up against them. But for every act of intimidation, the community responded with increased unity. Local youth who might have been gang recruits were instead finding mentorship through new community programs. Business owners who had once competed now worked together, sharing resources and information. Detective Ramirez coordinated with federal agencies, carefully managing the flow of information to avoid exposing Tom's true identity, while still protecting the community. "The Iron Wolves are losing their grip," he observed during a late-night strategy session, "but cornered animals are the most dangerous." Tom's taxi now carried more than just his cover equipment. Hidden compartments concealed surveillance gear, weapons, and communication devices. His routes were carefully planned to maintain his cover, while monitoring key locations in the gang's operation. The tension in South Beach was palpable. Everyone could sense that the situation was building towards something explosive. The Iron Wolves had been challenged not just by one man, but by an entire community that had found its courage. Their response would either cement their control or destroy them completely. As Tom drove through the neon-lit streets of Miami Beach, his radio picked up scattered communications between gang members. Code words and partial phrases that painted a picture of an organization preparing for war. But this wasn't just about territory anymore. The stakes had grown far beyond a simple turf battle, touching on international criminal networks that reached from the streets of South Beach to the highest levels of global finance. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly during a quiet afternoon at Rosa's. Tom sat at his usual corner booth, pretending to calculate his day's fares while actually monitoring a suspicious pattern of deliveries to a nearby hotel. A young man in a worn Iron Wolves vest entered the cafe, his nervous energy immediately drawing Tom's attention. The prospect, barely 20, ordered coffee with shaking hands and then, after several furtive glances around the cafe, approached Tom's table. "They're going to burn it all down," the young man, who introduced himself as Mickey, whispered. "Skull's lost it. He's talking about making examples, showing everyone what happens when you challenge the wolves, but that's not even the worst part." Mickey's hands trembled as he placed a smartphone on the table, showing photos of shipping containers at the port, documents with strings of numbers and meetings between gang leaders and well-dressed men in expensive suits. Through his earpiece, Tom could hear his handler's voice urging caution. This could be a trap, an attempt to feed false information. But Tom's years of experience reading people told him Mickey's fear was genuine. The young prospect had gotten in over his head, finding himself caught up in something far darker than the typical gang activities he'd expected. "I joined thinking it was just about bikes and brotherhood," Mickey continued, his voice barely audible. "But now they're talking about moving serious weight through the port, washing money through all these businesses. And if anyone gets in their way..." He trailed off, his implications clear. Detective Ramirez, watching from the counter while pretending to enjoy his Cuban sandwich, subtly activated his body camera to record the conversation. The intelligence Mickey provided could be crucial, but it also meant the situation was more volatile than they'd realized. Within hours, the information was verified through multiple sources. The Iron Wolves weren't just a local gang, they were a crucial link in an international criminal network. The attacks on local businesses weren't just about maintaining territory, they were about protecting a sophisticated money laundering operation that moved millions through Miami's tourist economy. "Your cover is more important than ever," Tom's handler stressed during an emergency briefing in a secured hotel room. "We're tracking connections to cartels in 3 countries. If the Iron Wolves operation gets disrupted too soon, we lose our chance to take down the entire network." But the community's transformation couldn't be stopped. What had started with one confrontation at Rosa's had sparked a movement. Business owners who had once paid protection money in fearful silence now shared security footage and information. Young people who might have been recruited by the gang were finding support and mentorship through new community programs. Mickey wasn't the only one looking for a way out. Other Iron Wolves members, particularly younger ones, began quietly reaching out. They shared stories of being drawn in by promises of brotherhood and belonging, only to find themselves caught up in international criminal enterprises that went far beyond motorcycle gang activities. Tom maintained his cover as the taxi driver who had stood up to the gang, but his role had evolved. Through careful cultivation of his image as a community figure, he was able to gather intelligence that would have been impossible to access through traditional law enforcement methods. People trusted the friendly cab driver who had shown courage in standing up to bullies. Rosa's cafe became more than just a gathering place. It transformed into an unofficial community center. Tom noticed how Rosa handled the situation with grace, creating a space where people felt safe sharing information over coffee and pastries. She never asked questions directly, but she heard everything and made sure important details reached the right ears. The Iron Wolves' leadership, meanwhile, was fracturing under pressure. Surveillance picked up heated arguments at their clubhouse. Some wanted to retreat, to cut their losses and relocate their operation. Others, led by Skull, pushed for violent retaliation. The tension was building toward an inevitable break. "We've identified 3 separate factions within the gang," Ramirez reported during a secure meeting. "Skull's hardliners who want to fight, a group looking to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal, and younger members like Mickey who want out completely. We can use these divisions." Through his taxi service, Tom began noticing changes in the gang's operations. Money movements became more erratic. Established patterns of activity shifted. The careful structure of their criminal enterprise was showing cracks, stressed by both internal conflicts and external pressure from the awakened community. Mickey continued providing information, each piece carefully verified through other sources. The young prospect had become valuable asset, though Tom never forgot the risks of trusting someone who had been part of the gang. Each interaction was carefully managed, each piece of intelligence cross-referenced. The community's transformation accelerated. Local business owners established a legitimate security cooperative, sharing resources and information. Former gang members, inspired by the changes they saw, began reaching out to community leaders, looking for ways to change their paths. The neighborhood was healing itself, growing stronger through unity rather than fear. As Tom drove his taxi through the sun-drenched streets of South Beach, he could see the physical manifestations of this change. Security cameras being installed, businesses reopening, people walking the streets with confidence rather than fear. But he also saw the dark undercurrents. Iron Wolves members watching from shadows, taking photos of traitors, planning their response to this challenge to their power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of a neighborhood, but the success or failure of an international investigation that had been months in the making. The question wasn't if the Iron Wolves would strike back, but when and how, and whether the transformed community would be strong enough to weather the storm that was coming. The flash drive appeared in Tom's taxi late one night, left by a passenger who vanished into the neon-lit streets of South Beach before he could be questioned. The data it contained sent shockwaves through multiple federal agencies. Detailed records of the Iron Wolves' entire operation, including offshore accounts, shipping manifests, and evidence linking them to international criminal organizations. More disturbing were the plans for what they called the Purge, a coordinated attack designed to destroy any resistance to their control through overwhelming force. "This isn't just about South Beach anymore," Tom's handler declared during an emergency briefing at a secure location. "We're looking at connections to cartels in Colombia, money laundering operations in Eastern Europe, and weapon shipments that suggest something much bigger in play." The evidence was compelling, but it also meant the stakes had risen dramatically. Detective Ramirez paced the small room, his usual calm demeanor shaken by what they'd discovered. "They're planning to hit everything at once. Rosa's, the other businesses, even people's homes. They're bringing in muscle from other chapters, professional enforcers. This isn't gang violence. This is terrorism." Through his earpiece, Tom could hear chatter about increased activity at the port. Surveillance teams reported shipping containers being moved at unusual hours, vehicles with out-of-state plates gathering at predetermined locations. The Iron Wolves were mobilizing for something unprecedented. Mickey, their young informant, arrived at Rosa's pale and shaking. "Skull's gone completely dark," he reported, his voice barely a whisper. "He's holed up in the clubhouse with some new guys, real heavy hitters. They're talking about making South Beach an example, showing every other territory what happens when people don't stay in line." The community, unaware of the full scope of the threat, continued its transformation. Local business owners met regularly, sharing resources and information. Former gang members worked with youth programs, trying to prevent the next generation from following their path. But beneath this progress, tension built like a tropical storm, gathering strength offshore. Tom's taxi routes became more strategic, mapping the movement of suspicious vehicles and individuals throughout South Beach. His trained eye noticed the subtle signs: new faces watching from darkened doorways, encrypted communications equipment being installed at key locations, weapons being moved under cover of night. "We can't wait for them to strike first," Tom argued during a secure video conference with his superiors. "If we move now, we can prevent civilian casualties and still maintain the larger investigation." But the response from Washington was clear. They needed more evidence to justify a major operation, proof that would stand up in international courts. Rosa noticed the changes in her regular customers. Some stopped coming altogether, while others changed their routines unpredictably. "Something's coming," she told Tom one quiet morning. "I can feel it in the air, like before a hurricane." Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen her share of storms, both natural and human-made. The flash drive's data revealed another disturbing element: corruption within local institutions. Several officials had been compromised, their cooperation bought with money laundered through seemingly legitimate businesses. The Iron Wolves' influence reached deeper than anyone had suspected. Detective Ramirez worked tirelessly, coordinating with trusted officers to prepare for what was coming. "We've identified safe houses, evacuation routes, and fallback positions," he reported. "But if their numbers are as big as we think, we're going to be overwhelmed." Tom's cover identity was becoming both an asset and a liability. As Big Tom, the taxi driver, he had unprecedented access to information and community trust. But his high profile after the confrontation at Rosa's made him an obvious target. Each fare could be a potential threat, each pickup a possible ambush. The pressure built as more intelligence poured in. Surveillance teams reported increased activity at known Iron Wolves locations. Financial tracking showed large sums of money being moved through their network. Communication intercepts suggested they were coordinating with other criminal organizations, preparing for something massive. Mickey's information became more urgent, more fragmented. "They're bringing in people I've never seen before," he reported during a clandestine meeting. "Professional guys, military training. This isn't about territory anymore. They're talking about making statements, sending messages that'll be heard across continents." Tom's handler pushed for immediate action. "If we wait too long, we'll lose control of the situation entirely. The community's safety has to be our priority." But Washington remained hesitant, concerned about compromising larger international investigations. The transformation of South Beach had caught the attention of media outlets nationwide. News crews arrived to document the story of a community standing up to gang influence, unaware they were recording the prelude to something far more dangerous. Their presence added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. As tension mounted, Tom noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The usual tourist crowd seemed thinner, as if they could sense the approaching storm. Local residents moved with greater caution, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Even the air seemed heavier, charged with the electricity of impending violence. The flash drive's data painted a clear picture of what was at stake. The Iron Wolves weren't just fighting for territory, they were protecting a crucial link in a global criminal network. Their response would be proportional to that importance, devastating, far-reaching, and designed to destroy any hope of resistance. In his taxi, monitoring the streets while maintaining his cover, Tom knew they were running out of time. The Iron Wolves were gathering their forces, preparing to strike with a fury that would reshape South Beach forever. The question wasn't whether they could stop it, but whether they could protect the community they'd sworn to serve when the storm finally broke. The first coordinated strike came at midnight. 3 simultaneous explosions rocked South Beach, targeting key businesses that had stood up to the Iron Wolves. The blasts were precisely calculated, large enough to send a message but small enough to avoid casualties. It was just the beginning, a warning shot that shattered the night and tested the community's resolve. Tom received the alert while monitoring suspicious activity near the port. Through his earpiece, reports flooded in from various agencies tracking the Iron Wolves' movements. The gang had finally shown their hand, but the pattern of attack suggested something more sophisticated than mere retaliation. "They're probing our response times," Tom reported from his taxi, watching emergency vehicles race past. "Testing our reactions, looking for weaknesses in our security network." His tactical training recognized the military precision behind the attacks. These weren't random acts of violence. This was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Detective Ramirez coordinated the police response from a mobile command center, his years of experience evident in his calm handling of the chaos. 3 more suspicious packages reported bomb squad en route. "We've got increased gang activity across all sectors, but something's off about their movements." The community's response surprised everyone, even Tom. Instead of retreating in fear, people emerged from their homes and businesses, helping secure damaged buildings and sharing security footage. The network they'd built over the past months activated seamlessly. Information flowed, resources were shared, and a united front emerged against the violence. Rosa's cafe became an impromptu command center, its backroom transformed into a coordination hub where business owners and community leaders gathered to share intelligence. Rosa herself moved between groups, her quiet strength helping maintain calm as reports of new threats continued to arrive. "They're trying to divide us," Mickey reported, slipping into the cafe through a back entrance. The young informant's face was drawn with worry. "Skull's telling everyone this is what happens when people don't respect the natural order, but half the crew isn't buying it anymore. These attacks? They're not our style. These new guys, the ones calling the shots now, they're something else entirely." Tom's handler's voice crackled through his secure earpiece. "Treasury just confirmed our worst fears. The money trail leads back to major international players. The Iron Wolves are just the local muscle for something much bigger. If we move too soon, we lose the whole network." But the immediate threat couldn't be ignored. Surveillance teams reported increased activity around the port, with heavily armed men gathering in warehouses and weapons being distributed. The Iron Wolves were preparing for their main assault, and time was running out. Through his taxi service, Tom maintained his cover while coordinating a complex web of defense. Each fare provided an opportunity to survey the neighborhood, noting changes in patterns and identifying potential threats. His passengers, many now regular informants, shared snippets of information that helped complete the larger picture. "We've got confirmation," Ramirez announced during an emergency meeting at Rosa's. "They're bringing in professional operators from overseas. These aren't street thugs. We're looking at former military, experienced in urban warfare. They're planning to turn South Beach into a war zone." The community's transformation faced its greatest test. Business owners who had once competed now shared resources and security personnel. Former gang members worked alongside community volunteers, their street knowledge proving invaluable in identifying potential targets and vulnerabilities. Tom's years of protective service experience recognized the patterns emerging. The explosions were just the first phase, designed to create chaos and stretch law enforcement resources thin. The real attack would come from an unexpected direction, targeting not just physical infrastructure, but the community's very spirit. "They're not just trying to reclaim territory," Tom explained to his handler. "They're trying to break the community's will to resist. These attacks are psychological as much as physical." His analysis was confirmed by intelligence reports showing the Iron Wolves leadership meeting with experts in urban destabilization. Rosa's security cameras captured a steady stream of suspicious activity: unknown vehicles performing surveillance, individuals photographing security measures, coded messages being passed in plain sight. But they also recorded something else: the community's growing resilience, its ability to adapt and respond to each new threat. Mickey's intelligence became more crucial as the situation escalated. "They're planning something big for tomorrow night," he reported, his voice shaking. "All members ordered to be ready. They're calling it reclamation, taking back everything they lost, making examples of anyone who stood against them." Tom coordinated with federal agencies through secure channels, balancing the need to protect the community with the larger goal of exposing the international criminal network. Each decision carried weight. Moving too soon could jeopardize years of investigation, but waiting too long could cost innocent lives. The streets of South Beach hummed with nervous energy as night fell. Tourist crowds thinned as word of the violence spread, leaving the usually bustling streets eerily quiet. In this silence, the community's defenders moved with purpose, securing positions and establishing communication networks. Through his taxi's windows, Tom observed the Iron Wolves' forces taking up positions throughout the neighborhood. Their movements were different now, more professional, more coordinated. These weren't the same thugs who had tried to intimidate a seemingly helpless taxi driver all those months ago. They had evolved into something more dangerous, backed by international criminal enterprises with resources and expertise. As midnight approached again, the community held its breath knowing that the next attack would be different. The Iron Wolves weren't just fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting to maintain their position in a global criminal network, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. The final confrontation began at dawn, as the first rays of sunlight painted Miami's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The Iron Wolves launched their assault with military precision, dozens of vehicles converging on South Beach from multiple directions, their movements coordinated through encrypted communications. But they found themselves facing something they hadn't expected: A community prepared and united, guided by an undercover agent who had anticipated their every move. Tom watched from his taxi as the first wave approached, his trained eye noting the professional formation of the incoming vehicles. "They're moving in tactical units," he reported through his secure channel. "Four-man teams, military-grade weapons, encrypted comms. These aren't gang members. They're mercenaries." Through his earpiece, he could hear multiple agencies coordinating their response, waiting for his signal. Detective Ramirez's voice crackled over the secure frequency. "All units in position. Safe houses secured. Evacuation routes clear." The weeks of preparation had transformed South Beach into a carefully orchestrated defensive network, with every alley and rooftop accounted for. The Iron Wolves' first move was textbook military strategy, targeting communications infrastructure to isolate the neighborhood. But they found their attempts blocked by redundant systems the community had installed, guided by Tom's expertise. Local businesses had created their own mesh network, independent of traditional communications channels. Rosa's cafe had become the heart of the resistance, its basement converted into a command center. Through carefully hidden cameras, they watched as Skull led his forces down Ocean Drive, his usual biker swagger replaced by something more ominous. The gang leader was accompanied by men whose bearing screamed professional military training, their movements precise and coordinated. "Remember," Tom's voice carried across the secure channel, "we're not just fighting for territory. We're defending the idea that communities can stand against corruption and violence." His words resonated with everyone who had been part of South Beach's transformation, from business owners to reformed gang members. The first engagement came at the intersection of Collins and 5th, where the Iron Wolves' advance team encountered what appeared to be minimal resistance. But as they moved to secure the area, hidden cameras and sensors tracked their every move, feeding information back to the command center. Tom's military experience had turned the urban landscape into a sophisticated tactical environment. Mickey's intelligence proved crucial. The young informant had provided detailed information about the gang's battle plans, allowing the defenders to prepare countermeasures. "They're expecting to face disorganized civilians," Tom told his handler. "Instead, they're walking into a coordinated defense strategy." The Iron Wolves' forces split into 3 groups, attempting to encircle the neighborhood's key points. But each move had been anticipated, met with a level of resistance that clearly surprised them. Local business owners, guided by Tom's tactical expertise, had transformed their properties into defensive positions. Former gang members used their street knowledge to predict and counter the attackers' movements. From his position near the port, Tom could see the larger operation unfolding. Federal agents were quietly moving into position, documenting connections between the Iron Wolves and their international partners. The gang's desperate attempt to maintain control had exposed the entire criminal network. The turning point came when Skull's team attempted to breach Rosa's cafe. The gang leader, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, led the assault personally. But as they approached, they found themselves facing not just physical defenses, but a community united in purpose. Store owners, residents, and even former gang members stood together, their presence a clear message that violence would no longer rule their streets. "This ends now." Tom's voice carried across the morning air as he stepped out of his taxi, finally dropping his cover. His movement was fluid, professional, years of training evident in every step. The confused looks on the mercenaries' faces showed they finally understood. They hadn't been fighting a simple community resistance. They'd been up against a highly trained federal operation. Detective Ramirez emerged with his tactical team, their positioning cutting off the gang's retreat routes. "Federal agents are moving in at the port," he announced over the secure channel. "The whole network is being rolled up. It's over, Skull." The Iron Wolves' professional mercenaries, recognizing the tactical situation, began to lower their weapons. They were soldiers for hire, and their employer's operation was clearly compromised. Skull, however, wasn't ready to surrender. His face contorted with rage as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. "You think this changes anything?" Skull snarled, his hand moving toward his weapon. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, the people behind us." But before he could finish, several of his own men grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. They had realized what Skull couldn't. The game was over. As federal agents swarmed the area, Tom maintained his position, coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure the operation's completion. The months of careful planning, of building community trust while gathering intelligence, had paid off. The Iron Wolves' attempt to reclaim their territory had instead exposed an international criminal network to federal scrutiny. Rosa emerged from her cafe, her expression a mixture of relief and triumph. The community gathered around her, no longer afraid, their unity having proven stronger than any attempt at intimidation. The transformation that had begun with one confrontation in her cafe had led to something none of them had expected: the complete dismantling of a criminal empire. Through his earpiece, Tom could hear reports of simultaneous raids taking place across Miami and beyond. The evidence they'd gathered had provided the justification for a massive federal operation, targeting not just the Iron Wolves but their entire international network. What had started as a simple undercover assignment had evolved into one of the largest organized crime busts in Florida history. 3 months after the final confrontation, South Beach had transformed into a model of community renewal. The Iron Wolves clubhouse had been converted into a youth center, its walls now covered with vibrant murals instead of gang symbols. Former gang members, under the guidance of reformed leaders like Mickey, worked alongside community volunteers to mentor at-risk youth, showing them a different path than the one they'd originally chosen. Tom sat at his usual booth in Rosa's cafe, no longer maintaining his cover as a taxi driver. His official role had ended with the dismantling of the Iron Wolves network, but he found himself drawn back to the community that had become more than just an assignment. The cafe had been renovated, the bullet holes and battle scars repaired, but its spirit remained unchanged, a symbol of resistance transformed into a beacon of hope. The final numbers came in from Treasury, Detective Ramirez reported, sliding into the booth across from Tom. Over $300 million in illegal funds tracked and seized, connections to criminal organizations in 12 countries. The Iron Wolves were just the tip of the iceberg. The detective looked tired but satisfied, the weeks of intense operation finally showing results beyond their expectations. Rosa approached their table with fresh Cuban coffee, her movements confident and proud. The cafe was busier than ever, now famous as the place where a community's transformation had begun. "Did you hear?" she asked, setting down their cups. "The city council approved our proposal. We're getting funding for the Neighborhood Watch program, youth outreach, everything we asked for." Through the cafe's windows, Tom could see the physical changes in the neighborhood. New businesses had opened, filling spaces left vacant by years of gang intimidation. Security cameras and emergency call boxes had been installed, not as tools of surveillance, but as symbols of community protection. The streets buzzed with energy, tourists mixing with locals, children playing without fear, elderly residents enjoying evening walks. "You created something special here," Tom's handler had told him during their final debriefing. "What happened in South Beach? It's becoming a template for other communities facing similar challenges." The success of their operation had caught the attention of law enforcement agencies nationwide, all wanting to understand how one undercover assignment had led to such comprehensive change. Mickey had become a leader in his own right, working with youth outreach programs to prevent gang recruitment. "It's different when you can show them another way," he explained to a group of community leaders. "These kids aren't looking for trouble, they're looking for belonging, for purpose. We just have to show them there are better ways to find it." The international impact of their operation continued to ripple outward. The evidence they'd gathered had led to arrests across 3 continents, exposing corruption networks that had operated with impunity for decades. South Beach's transformation had proved that local action could have global consequences. Detective Ramirez had been promoted, but he remained deeply involved in the community's ongoing development. "We're seeing other neighborhoods following our model," he reported during a community meeting. "The combination of law enforcement cooperation and community engagement, it's changing how we approach these problems." The former Iron Wolves members who had chosen to cooperate had been integrated into legitimate security and community service roles. Their knowledge of street operations proved invaluable in preventing new criminal organizations from filling the vacuum left by their former gang. More importantly, they provided living proof that change was possible. that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities. Rosa's Cafe had evolved into more than just a restaurant. It hosted community meetings, provided space for youth programs, and served as a gathering point for people working to maintain and expand the neighborhood's transformation. The tables where once people had sat in fearful silence now buzzed with conversation and laughter. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Rosa confided to Tom one quiet evening. "How one moment, one decision to stand up instead of staying quiet could change everything." Her words captured the essence of what had happened in South Beach, how individual courage, when supported by community unity, could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The tourist industry had rebounded stronger than ever, with South Beach's story of transformation adding a new dimension to its appeal. Visitors came not just for the beaches and nightlife, but to see how a community had reclaimed its soul from corruption and violence. Tom found himself wrestling with the impact of his assignment. His career had involved numerous undercover operations, but none had affected him quite like this one. The connections he'd formed, the changes he'd witnessed and helped facilitate, challenged his professional detachment. "The agency wants to know if you'd consider consulting on similar operations," his handler mentioned during their last meeting. "Your approach here, combining traditional undercover work with community engagement, it's revolutionizing how we think about these assignments." The physical evidence of their success was everywhere, in the renovated buildings, the new security systems, the community programs that had sprung up in the wake of the Iron Wolves' departure. But the real transformation was less tangible, visible in the way people carried themselves, in the pride they took in their neighborhood, in the sense of ownership and responsibility that had replaced fear and resignation. As the sun set over Ocean Drive, casting long shadows across the Art Deco facades, Tom realized that his role in South Beach's story had created something that would outlast any single operation or assignment. He had helped catalyze a change that would continue to grow and evolve, proving that even the most entrenched criminal enterprises could be overcome when communities found the courage to stand together. 1 year after the fall of the Iron Wolves, Tom stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., presenting the South Beach model to an international conference on community-based law enforcement. The audience included police chiefs, federal agents, and community leaders from around the world, all eager to understand how a single undercover operation had evolved into a revolutionary approach to combating organized crime. "The key wasn't just gathering intelligence or making arrests," Tom explained, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It was understanding that lasting change comes from within communities themselves. We didn't just dismantle a criminal network. We helped build something stronger in its place." The screens behind him showed images of South Beach's transformation, from the first confrontation at Rosa's to the thriving community it had become. Back in Miami, Rosa's Cafe had become a mandatory stop for law enforcement officials studying the South Beach model. Rosa herself had been invited to speak at police academies and community organizations, sharing her perspective on how businesses could work with law enforcement to create positive change. Her cafe's walls now displayed photos documenting the neighborhood's journey, including a prominent image of an overweight taxi driver standing up to a gang of bikers. "The ripple effects continue to amaze us," Detective Ramirez reported during a national law enforcement symposium. "We're seeing criminal organizations struggling to maintain control in other areas because communities are replicating what happened here. They're losing their grip, not through force, but through the power of united communities." Mickey had transformed from informant to community leader, running a successful program that helped former gang members transition to legitimate employment. "We don't just offer them jobs," he explained to a group of visiting officials. "We show them they can be part of something bigger than themselves, something that builds up their community instead of tearing it down." The Treasury Department's final report on the operation revealed the full scope of their success. The Iron Wolves network had been a crucial link in a global criminal enterprise, and its dismantling had disrupted illegal operations worth billions. More importantly, the method used in South Beach had provided a new template for combating organized crime. "What makes this approach unique," Tom's handler explained to a Senate committee, "is its sustainability. Traditional law enforcement operations often create power vacuums that new criminal organizations quickly fill. But when communities are empowered to maintain their own security, that cycle is broken. The physical transformation of South Beach continued to evolve. The former Iron Wolves territories had been reclaimed by legitimate businesses and community organizations. Security cameras that had once been tools of gang surveillance now served as part of a community-managed safety network. The streets that had once fallen quiet at sundown now buzzed with activity long into the night. Rosa had expanded her operation, opening a second cafe that doubled as a community center. "People need places where they can come together," she explained during a local news interview. "Not just to eat, but to connect, to share information, to build the relationships that make a community strong." Her model was being studied by business owners in other cities facing similar challenges. Tom's role had evolved as well. While still actively involved in federal law enforcement, he had become a key advisor on community-based operations. His experience in South Beach had demonstrated that successful undercover work wasn't just about maintaining cover. It was about understanding and engaging with the communities being protected. "The most powerful weapon against organized crime isn't guns or arrests," he told a graduating class of federal agents. "It's hope. When people believe they can change their circumstances, when they see proof that standing together works, that's when real transformation becomes possible." The international impact of their operation continued to grow. Law enforcement agencies from Europe to Asia sent representatives to study the South Beach model. Criminal organizations found themselves facing not just police action, but entire communities united against their influence. Mickey's youth program had become a national model, with similar initiatives launching in cities across the country. "These kids aren't so different from who I used to be," he reflected during a community meeting. "They just need to see that there's another path, that they can be part of building something instead of destroying it." Detective Ramirez had been promoted to lead a new division focused on community-based law enforcement strategies. "What we learned in South Beach changed everything," he explained to his team. "We stopped thinking about communities as battlegrounds and started seeing them as partners in their own protection." The tourist industry in South Beach had evolved to embrace its new identity. Visitors still came for the beaches and nightlife, but they also came to see how a community had transformed itself. Local tour guides included stops at Rosa's cafe, sharing the story of how one confrontation had sparked a movement. Tom occasionally returned to his taxi driver persona, maintaining connections with the network of informants and community members he'd built during the operation. These relationships continued to provide valuable intelligence, not just about criminal activities but about the community's ongoing needs and challenges. "The real measure of our success," he told his handler during their annual review, "isn't in the arrests made or assets seized. It's in the children playing freely in parks that were once gang territories, in businesses operating without fear of extortion, in communities that know they have the power to stand up to organized crime." As the sun set over South Beach, casting its golden light across the Art Deco facades and busy streets, the transformation they had achieved continued to inspire hope in communities around the world. What had started as one agent's undercover assignment had evolved into a movement, proving that when law enforcement and communities truly worked together, even the most entrenched criminal enterprises could be overcome by the power of united purpose and unwavering determination. As evening settled over Miami Beach, with the golden sun casting long shadows across Ocean Drive, the transformation that had begun with one confrontation in a small cafe continued to ripple outward. Tom sat at his familiar corner booth in Rosa's, watching the vibrant community life unfold through the windows. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Rosa asked, setting down a fresh cup of Cuban coffee. "One moment of standing up to bullies changing so many lives?" Through the cafe's windows, he could see Mickey leading a youth group meeting in the converted community center that had once been the Iron Wolves clubhouse. Detective Ramirez's patrol car passed by, the officer waving to local business owners who no longer lived in fear. The streets buzzed with a mixture of tourists and locals, all sharing in the energy of a neighborhood that had found its soul. "The South Beach model, they're calling it now," Tom reflected. his cover as a taxi driver long since revealed, but his connection to the community unchanged. But it's really the power of people standing together, refusing to let fear rule their lives. The final statistics told only part of the story. Millions in seized assets, dozens of arrests across multiple countries, an international criminal network dismantled. But the real success was visible in the everyday moments. Children playing freely in parks, businesses thriving without paying protection money, former gang members mentoring at-risk youth. As the Miami sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Tom smiled at the scene before him. What had started as an undercover assignment had become something far more significant, a testament to the power of unity, courage, and the unwavering belief that communities could transform themselves when they stood together against corruption and violence. In the end, it wasn't just about taking down the iron wolves. It was about proving that hope, when backed by collective action, could overcome even the most entrenched criminal enterprises.